Welcome back, fellow beings.
Hey you guys, welcome back for another video of true, strange, and unusual events that people out there experience and want to know just what the heck is going on. Anyway, I'd like to say thank you for your patience. I wasn't able to get this video out as soon as I wanted to due to a little hiccup where I had appendicitis last weekend. Yay! So I was in the hospital for most of the week for that. And after getting out of the hospital, I took a couple of days to recover. And here we are, back on some more stories. And to follow up from the last video, I wanted to do this video on BEPs, where we're talking about black-eyed people. Not so much as kids. There might be one or two stories in here that I've come across to add to that, but for the most part, these stories are going to focus more on black-eyed adults that people have come across in strange situations.
So with that out of the way, number 11.
Lakeland, Florida, July 12th, 1998. Sometime in the evening, a female security guard spotted a strange alien entity standing in the corner of Dixie Highway and Lucerne Road. The entity had pasty white skin, reddish blonde hair, and black button eyes. His nose was small, his lips were very thin, and his eyes were black in color with almost no white area. He had neither eyelashes nor other facial nor body hair. His head was unusually large, while his ears were very small. He moved very slowly with short little steps and was apparently wearing normal human clothing. The next evening, the same or similar entity appeared outside the security guard workplace over 12 miles away. When a third party approached the entity, it mysteriously disappeared, and the police were notified.
Number 10.
I don't know if this counts as something you're interested in, but here's my accounts of seeing 4 BEK on 2 separate occasions. Both occurred just before dusk. I was within 10 or 15 feet of them. We lived around 2 different college towns, so we've seen some of the prettiest and some of the most god-awful body decor that one can imagine. Sometimes younger kids will mirror the trendy college kids. It doesn't bother us nor shock us to see unusual, bedecked humans. We're used to it. The first time was within a couple weeks after Halloween. It was the year the Emily Rose movie came out, in 2005, I think. 2 boys, one maybe 15, the other maybe 9, dressed alike in plaid shirts, regular jackets, and jeans. They were in a department store waiting for one of the employees to give them a ride home. The 2 boys looked at me and I saw their solid black eyes. Their lids were red and irritated looking. To me, they were normal kids wearing contacts. The second time was some months later. There was a boy about 14 and a girl about 6 standing on the sidewalk by another department store. They were dressed oddly in plain clothes that favored nurse scrubs, and the fabric looked like sackcloth. There was no creep factor when they looked at me with their solid black eyes and pitiful faces. However, I felt a heavy sense of sadness for them. Again, to me they were normal kids just wearing contacts. I have heard that there are eye medications that can turn an eye completely black, so it may be possible that these kids were just suffering an eye disease. I'll let you be the judge of that.
Number 9.
Adele was at home when she had her experience with these beings. More unnerving, perhaps, they were small children. I was sitting in my bedroom reading a book. Adele says, "At about 11 p.m. I heard a knocking. A slow, constant one. I got up out of bed to see what it was. I looked out the window and to my surprise saw 2 children. I opened the window and asked them what they wanted at this time of night. They replied by saying,
'Let us in.
I said no and asked what for.
We want to use your bathroom.'
I was quite shocked that the children of about 10 years old wanted to use the stranger's bathroom at this time of night. I told them no and closed the window, but looked at them through the glass. I glanced at their eyes, and I had never seen eyes like that before. They were completely black. I got the feeling of evil and unhappiness. It surrounded me. It was horrible.
Number 8.
When the child was last seen, she sparked worldwide interest, and it is today a cult internet sensation. Latest descriptions of the girl, who has coal-black pits for eye sockets, are identical to those chronicled in the early 1980s, UK's Birmingham Mail reports. The spectre, described as having black eyes with no iris, no white, nothing, has been seen again in the area of Cannock Chase in the Midlands. Alerted by what sounded like screams, a shocked woman came across the wandering, sightless spectre while walking in Birches Valley. We instantly started running toward the noise. We couldn't find the child anywhere, and so we stopped to catch our breath. That's when I turned around and saw a girl stood behind me, no more than 10 years old, with her hands over her eyes. It was as if she was waiting for a birthday cake. I asked if she was okay and if she had been the one screaming. She put her arms down by her sides and opened her eyes. That's when I saw they were completely black. I jumped back and grabbed my daughter. When I looked again, the child was gone. It was so strange.
Number 7.
I had an encounter in 1987 with a black-eyed man. It was July 4th in late afternoon. My then boyfriend and I were on a motorcycle ride in the country just outside of Capron, Illinois. I'm positive of the date because it was my birthday. And maybe because it was the 4th of July, I don't know. Anyway. There wasn't any traffic on the road other than a yellow and white pickup coming toward us. As he came closer, he started to slowly cross the center line and drive straight at us. We were doubled on the bike, and I was on the back. He forced us off the road and into the ditch. This guy came all the way into our lane and toward us in the ditch, but just drove past us instead of coming after us. My boyfriend managed to keep the bike moving so we didn't dump or crash. While he was trying to keep the bike up, I looked up to see who was driving. This guy had his window down, his face pale as can be, and no eye color except for solid black. He had no expression whatsoever. He looked disappointed that we didn't die. This thing and I locked eyes, if you want to call it that, and I never once saw him look back at the road while he drove off. He just kept turning his head, staring at me. My boyfriend didn't get a look at the guy, but being a big, bad biker, he wanted to turn around and go after him. I told him what I saw and talked him out of it, and we just spent the rest of the day at home. It's been a lot of years since that happened, but it still haunts me to this day.
Number 6.
Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, August 15th, 2014. I was a waiting customer in line at Pep Boy's auto shop, just looking around. A small woman entered, and she appeared oddly dressed. She looked to be in her 70s, early 80s, at first because of her rather messy gray hair, which fell about to the chin line. She was about 4 to 5 feet tall and wore very short, baggy, unironed shorts and a baggy, unironed blouse. She had very thin legs and arms, grayish, pinkish skin. She did not have the characteristics of progeria disease. Her face seemed normal. My name was called and I had turned my attention to business at hand and went to sit in the adjacent waiting room. I had been seated there about 15 minutes when this same woman came up to the all-glass door and tried to pull it open. She could not pull it open with one hand since her other hand was holding a small book and drink. I started to get up to walk across the room to help her with the door, but someone sitting beside the door opened it for her. She then sat down about 4 feet away from me at a right-degree angle. I was curious about her since she seemed so strangely dressed. I looked directly at her eyes, and her eyes met mine, and that's when I noticed they were completely black. I was startled, and I must have looked so because she got up instantly and walked out of the waiting room. I followed after her about 20 seconds later, but saw her no more after looking around a bit. She may have been wearing a wig, she may have had a different kind of contact lenses in her eyes, but something about her just seemed strange. I have been wondering whether she was a hybrid. I also wonder whether anyone else has had an experience similar to this.
Number 5.
I have just finished reading the stories about black-eyed people, and I had to share this. It was around March in 2003. I live in Adelaide, Australia, and March is the beginning of the fall, but the nights can be still quite warm. I was working at a coffee shop in the city at the time and decided to walk home that night. It would take me 45 minutes to walk home, but figured, what the hey. I was about halfway home and it was already dark. It would have been about 7 p.m. I was just walking past my local library when I noticed a homeless guy who I'd seen around our neighborhood the last few months. He was heading towards me up the sidewalk. I knew I didn't like the guy because he was always grinning and staring at me, and as I came closer, I made a point of avoiding eye contact. For some reason, as I was passing him, I looked up into his eyes, and they were completely black. He was also grinning at me, all teeth barred, like I was a tasty meal, or that I was unaware of the best joke ever. I remember being shocked and scared, and I raced home as fast as I could. I turned back once, and he was just standing there staring after me. When I got home, I told my boyfriend, but he brushed me off. I don't know who or what this guy was, but I've never forgotten it, and I still feel scared whenever I think about it.
Number 4.
I've always told myself I wouldn't write about this only because I don't like bringing attention to things I encounter. But today it's really bothering me and I feel I need to talk about it. About 5 years ago when I was still in high school, it was summer break and I was heading into town to see my boyfriend at the time and spend the day with him. Nothing was abnormal that day from what I can remember. I remember feeling so happy to be with him and spending some much needed time with him. When the time came to head back home, we said our goodbyes and I hopped in my truck and started to drive out of town. The way out of town that I was taking was going to have to pass the town cemetery and the town's nursing home. Sadly, they were right next to each other, as sick as that is, but this time was different. As I'm driving along, I see an old woman walking down my side of the road, and at first I don't really think anything of it. I just figure maybe she escaped from the nursing home. The closer I get, though, the more I come to realize that she was different. I remember she was kind of short, maybe about 5'2". It's hard to determine properly when you're in a vehicle, but she had white curly hair, pale skin, and she seemed to be wearing white colored cloths as well. She was also carrying a black briefcase, which I thought was a little strange, but it was her face that caught me off guard and made me do a double take at her. I remember her face was very pale, and even from a distance, I could see her eyes were strange, but once I was right up next to her, I realized she had pure black eyes. It almost looked like she had no eyes at all and just pure black holes in her face. On top of that, her tongue was sticking straight out of the right of her mouth. She stopped in her tracks and was staring at me as I drove by her, or whatever it was. As I drove past it, I know I had a horrified expression on my face. And I looked in the rearview mirror and it was still staring at me going down the road until I went around a curve and it couldn't see me anymore. I'm sorry, but as I write this, I can't call it a she anymore because I know that there was something terrible about this thing. I remember I was driving past it and I felt a heavy sensation of hatred and guilt. I got an overwhelming smell of rot and I wanted to just throw up. Plus, I felt as if my life was over and I just wanted to drive my truck into a tree and end my life. This was not a normal thing I encountered. It was terrifying, and I never want to witness anything like it ever again. I instantly began crying once this horrible sensation was gone, and I called my boyfriend and told him everything, and he jumped into his truck to go and see if he could find this thing, as it was maybe only 5 minutes after I encountered it, and he stayed on the phone with me the entire time. He told me he didn't see anything. As I said before, though, this is not something I've openly discussed with people before, because I don't like talking about it. But I'm curious if anyone else out there has had an encounter of this kind of thing.
Number 3.
This is an interesting and unusual story in that this black-eyed woman actually lived with and interacted with others in a senior citizens community. Here's the story. It's from paranormal.about.com. I recently relocated into an independent living community, and on the second day I was there, I was introduced to a black-eyed woman, very tall, likely in her 80s. Her eyes were very large and jet black, no whites at all. She seemed pleasant enough in the beginning. During her small talk at the breakfast table that first day, she described herself as 95% blind, able to see only shadows and dim light. She told the ladies at our table that she had been married 4 times. One marriage ended in divorce, and the other 3 marriages ended with the death of her husbands. Over the next few weeks in watching her, I realized that she was faking disabilities. I watched her walk without the use of a walker on several occasions, and she had far more visual ability than she admitted to. She could see anything that she wanted to, and when I saw this ability displayed on many occasions, she made several rude, unkind, hateful things to me in the presence of others. Other residents seemed to distance themselves from her because of this. Finally, one evening, in the dining room, I was sitting with a friend, not even thinking about any of this. Suddenly, without warning, this black-eyed woman walked up to our table and spoke my name. When I looked up, she had a large container of ice and water that she threw in my face. She very quickly retreated to another area of the building away from the dining room without her walker. I was in such a state of shock, soaking wet and traumatized out of my mind, I called 911 for the police. As soon as I could get myself relocated, I moved out. I knew that I was not safe in this facility. Another interesting thing is that while pretending to be almost totally blind and helpless, I never, ever saw her blink her eyes.
Number 2.
This story comes from a man named Don Thomas. It's an excerpt from a longer article about black-eyed beings on Mysterious Universe. I'll post the link in the description.
15 years or so ago, my brother had a son who was born with pale clear white skin and sea green eyes that were very weird to say the least. When he turned about 1 year old, his eyes turned black as coal and you could not see any of the white around them.
Thomas gave his nephew the nickname Turtle because of the boy's eyes, although he thought they looked like the eyes of a creature more sinister.
They really look more like shark's eyes, but I found that a little cruel for a little boy.
The baby grew into a quiet little boy who kept mainly to himself.
Most people found him weird, and most kids were afraid of him. He could not get near TVs or any other electronics because they began to distort. No one thought much about it but me.
The boy took an affinity to Thomas because Thomas was one of the few people who paid attention to him.
He would just come around where I was and just sit there for hours, never saying a word.
But the boy's family lived some distance away, so Thomas didn't see him often. However, a hiking trip when the boy was about 5 years old will always stick in Thomas's mind.
We came to a clearing, a funny yellow field in the middle of nowhere, and I noticed that he stopped and began staring toward the trees.
He asked the boy what he was staring at, but the boy wouldn't answer.
After a minute or so, he pointed and looked in that direction. At first I didn't see anything, but then I saw some movement in the shadows of the trees.
As Thomas looked at the trees, he saw what looked like at least 3 children wearing black hoodies.
They appeared just beyond the trees, but did not come any closer. I say 3 or so because it looked like more in the tree lines and further in.
Terror gripped Thomas because he grabbed his nephew's hand.
As we left the area, he kept looking back and began to cry.
Soon after, the boy's parents divorced and Thomas rarely saw him.
He began having problems with antisocial behavior and disappearing from home more and more often. I heard he was institutionalized and sometime later disappeared from the facility and was never found. This has since been a closed subject, and no one will talk about it in my family.
Number 1.
First, I'd just like to say that I've never been a believer in the supernatural, paranormal, etc. I think that everything has a logical explanation that maybe only seems bizarre because of a certain kind of overexcitement that many people have about an experience from the other side, or what have you. There is absolutely no explanation for what I'm about to share with you, and it absolutely scares the crap out of me. Just recounting this is giving me a really creepy feeling that I don't even think I'll be able to shake. Maybe ever. About 3 years ago, I was sitting in a local coffee shop in upstate New York during a little road trip. The restaurant was empty except for me and the night waitress. She was really pleasant and talked a lot. She was offering places to check out while I was in town and seemed amazingly astute. In fact, she seemed almost prescient, even guessing my age almost to the day and the month, and even certain things that I was actually planning to do the next day. It was so lighthearted, I thought I really lucked out by meeting an easygoing, smart young lady quite out of my normal way. At closing time, she went to the back. I guess to put some cash in the safe or something. As I was sitting there wondering what time I wanted to get up and hit the road again the next day, I momentarily thought I might even invite her for a few hours of R&R. I decided instead to just remember the store and next time I passed through the area to remember to stick my head in and say hi. So I got up and knocked on the door in the back of the coffee shop where she went in. At this time, there were only 2 dim lights in the main eating area, and barely any lights in the back room where she was. I opened the door. This woman who I had just finished talking to was standing, facing me, just standing there in the back of the dark room when I opened the door. Her skin was suddenly a clammy, cracked olive color, and her eyes were just black. I mean, no white at all. Her eyes and mouth was open really wide, and she was screaming in the most spine-chilling sounds, something I couldn't understand. I literally screamed myself, and she started moving from one spot to the other through the room, not running, just moving. Her clothes now looked all old, and she moved so fast. The back of the room must have been 15 feet or so back, and she just darted from side to side in the room, still facing me, back and forth at an impossible speed. Then she ran directly at me, as I was now standing away from the door in the middle of the restaurant. I got the hell out of there. I jumped in my car, still seeing her nightmarish face in the restaurant, darting to every window at an impossible velocity. The worst thing was, as I tore out of the parking lot, I looked in my rearview mirror, and she was sitting in the back seat, still with that nightmare expression, still screaming. Then she just vanished as I was panicked, just gone. I don't know what that was that spoke to me in that restaurant that day, but I know that it wasn't a prank. I swear at night sometimes I hear shadows moving in the dark in my room, just grinning a really ugly, evil grin. I haven't slept properly since. Okay, you guys, thanks again on joining me for another video about this strange and unusual and the black-eyed people this time. So, what do you guys think? There's lots of theories about black-eyed people. Of course, we've got the idea that people are abducted and impregnated by aliens, and then you get these hybrids. And that story about that nephew is really interesting because if you really learn about alien abductions and impregnations, people claim that they're impregnated for a few months and then they're re-abducted and the fetus is removed. It's really unusual. It's like there's a story where the fetus was not removed. Of course, other people also kind of believe that maybe black-eyed people are demons, if you want to go the religious way versus the science fiction way. I think the TV show Supernatural probably kind of helps instill that thought into people's minds. So what do you guys think? Once again, if you enjoyed the video, leave a like please, and go ahead and subscribe if you don't want to miss any more true stories about unexplainable experiences. Once again, I'm sorry it took me so long to get this one out. I've been busy on top of being, having doctors cut me open and stuff. And so, once again, thanks for listening. And remember,
Be aware and keep your eyes open.